Madness in the Victorian Woman, and focusing in the presentation on Jane Eyre and Bertha Mason, and then later on in the class I'll be looking at some other material. So to start with then, Jane Eyre. I want to look at Jane Eyre in the Red Room, where she's sent as a little girl and she's punished for supposed bad behaviour. She's sent into the Red Room. Last week we were looking at Jane Eyre. We were talking about the colonial aspects and how it connected with the British Empire and all of that sort of racial and those kinds of issues connected with gender, but focusing on it from that point of view. And now I'd like to look at the issue of mental health, which was also a very, very big gender issue in the 19th century, when women were about twice as likely to be considered insane as men. So, she's locked up in the Red Room as a punishment for being passionate. If you remember, we started last week with her. I'm going to turn that off. It's a bit, I think it's a bit clearer if we turn that off. We started last week with her being bullied by her cousin John Reed, and I looked at that in terms of, she was a Turk. She says she's sitting in the window like a Turk, and he's a slave driver, a Roman emperor, and we talked about it like that. But in terms of the narrative, what happens is that she fights back for the first time in her life. She's always been frightened of him, but she's actually terrified that he's really going to hurt her. In fact, he really does hurt her. And she fights back. I felt him grasp my hair and shoulder. He had closed with a desperate thing. He'd come into contact with somebody. He was trying to fight with somebody who was really desperate. I really saw in him a tyrant, a murderer. And she's a little girl, and she feels she's fighting for her life. I felt a drop or two of blood from my head trickle down my neck. Remember, he threw this book at her and actually cut her head. And was sensible of somewhat pungent suffering. These sensations for the time predominated over fear. And I received him in frantic sort, meaning I fought back viciously. Okay, so she really, it's not made clear exactly what she does to him, but she fights back, and he goes screaming, and of course his mother arrives, and the servants arrive, and he attracts attention, and she's going to get the blame. So the housekeeper and maid arrive, and they're scandalized by, not by a boy bullying a girl, but they're scandalized by the girl flying at Master John. Dear, dear, what a fury. And did ever anybody see such a picture of passion? I think I mentioned last week that passion was the prince somewhere at the back there. I think I mentioned last week that passion was kind of something that women weren't supposed to have. Women were supposed to be sunao. They were supposed to be passive and calm. And Jane's passion is a central theme in this novel. And the way she has to learn to deal with her passion, the way she has to learn to control her feelings, is a central aspect of the novel. So her aunt arrives and says, take her away to the Red Room and lock her in there. So that's going to be her punishment. And so they do. They take her and they lock her in the Red Room. And, okay, what is this Red Room? It's the place where her uncle died. Mrs. Reed's husband died there some years ago, and it's not been used ever since. It's been kept in good condition in his memory, but it's not used. I think it's actually, this is the best red room I could find a picture of on the internet, but I think it was mostly a bedroom rather than anything else. It's usually shown as a bedroom, rather. This looks more like a living room. But she's locked. The point is that she's locked up. She can't get out of it. And she's a very sensitive child, and she panics. Okay? And she thinks she sees her uncle's ghost. And she has a kind of fit. And she falls unconscious. And when she wakes up, she's in bed under the care of a kindly gentleman who is an apothecary. That's slightly lower than a doctor. A doctor is qualified to diagnose illnesses. An apothecary is somebody who makes up the medicine. Usually, that's his job, to make up and administer medicine. He's what Mrs. Reed calls when the servants are sick. And Jane is being treated like the servants here. They're not getting a doctor for her because that's what the family has. She gets a sort of second-rate treatment. But he is a kindly person, and he listens to her, and he understands, what's happening. He comes to be on her side and he feels that she's being cruelly treated in the family. But even so, this incident is described as having a lifelong effect on her. She says, "It only gave my nerves a shock of which I feel the reverberation to this day." Okay, it could have been worse than that, but it gave her nerves a shock of which I feel the reverberation to this day. It's a lifelong experience of terror that she had from being locked up in that red room. But she's lucky. I mean, I think what could have happened, the fearful pangs of mental suffering she experiences are just a pale shadow of what sometimes happened to people in those kinds of situations. It all depended on Mr. Lloyd being sympathetic. Just imagine Mr. Lloyd. Okay, suppose it had been someone else. Suppose it had been someone who didn't regard her sympathetically. Someone who felt that her symptoms were a sign of madness. But it could have been, that could have been what happened. And all it took in those days was for two people, qualified people, to agree that she was mad, and she would be locked up. And it could happen a lot more easily than you think. Okay, we'll be looking at some examples later on in the second part of the lesson. She was hysterical, all right? I mean, she wasn't reasonable or normal. She was hysterical. She was imagining things. There was no ghost of the father. It was just the gardener carrying the light in a lantern across the garden in the evening as she imagined something. She behaved in an extreme way, and she worked herself up so much that she had a fit and she lost consciousness. I mean, some doctors, even today, have difficulty, understanding the way that male doctors, even today, have difficulty sometimes in understanding the reactions of women and the behavior of women. They're likely to be told, you must be crazy, and it's still happening, okay? The fearful pangs of mental suffering that Jane experiences at that time could have been seen by a doctor as a form of mental illness. And if that had been the case, she could have been taken away and she could have been locked up. And of course, all the doctors in those days were men. There were no female doctors. The first female doctor comes around the middle of the 19th century, if you remember from last week's, I showed the reforms and things, and you start to have female doctors from about the middle of the century onwards. And here's an example of a hysterical woman. She's being exhibited. It's more like, it's kind of like a sort of medical, it's a medical conference, but it's like a kind of performance in a way. It's like a kind of a show. She's being brought on. Here we have her. Here's the crazy woman. Okay? She's brought on in front of course, all these men. This is actually a conference in Paris later on in the century, 1887. So this still go on through later on in the century. The idea that women were particularly susceptible to being crazy, and the sort of it would be the men who would be observing and deciding that. So you're still getting this going on even in the later part of the 19th century. Jane Eyre, if you remember, this is happening in the when would Jane be locked up in the Red Room? This would be before 1820, okay? So it would be the earlier part of the 19th century. And things was that much more primitive in regard to attitudes towards mental illness. There's a fairly famous book written in 1986 called The Female Malady by Elaine Showalter. She writes about the feminization of madness during the 19th century. She talks about how images of mad people before the 19th century, they tended to be wild, dark, naked men. Okay, that was your mad person, a wild, dark, naked man. And then it was replaced by a poetic, artistic, theatrical image of a youthful, beautiful woman. That's how insanity started to be seen, all right, like that, in contrast to the wild, naked men that had been used to represent insanity in art, in illustrations in books and so on. So you're getting a sort of feminization of madness. It's being seen as typically a woman's malady, a woman's illness. She sees this in the context of the Enlightenment, which we talked about. The Enlightenment was the sort of age of reason that grew up in the 18th century, when people stopped believing in things like witches and put their faith in science and logical reasoning. And in that post-Enlightenment world, it's mostly led by men. It's men who are logical, it's men who are reasonable, it's men who can be cultural and civilized and who can discourse, who can talk about various things, and who are, they're focused on the sort of mind, on the mental approach to understanding the world, whereas women were typically situated on the other side, irrational, silent. They were natural, but they weren't civilized. All right, that was the sort of image of them, and focused on the body rather than on the mind. So the Enlightenment was only a sort of partial enlightenment because it was mostly focused on men. I mean, even the French Revolution, as we saw, did not want to give the vote to women and did not want to make women citizens in its post-revolutionary world. It was limited to being, citizenship was limited to men, not extended to women. So yes, on the one hand, you've got the male paradigm, reason, discourse, culture, mind. You could add words like that to activity and independence. All right, it was the man who was the active kind of, and when it comes to sexuality, men were supposed to have a healthy appetite. I mean, men who had a healthy appetite, that wasn't going to be seen as a problem. All right, but women, we've talked about the irrationality, silence, nature, body, and in contrast to men, the woman was supposed to be passive. The man was active, the woman was passive. She was seen as dependent. She needed to be looked after. Whether she really needed to be looked after is another matter, but the Victorian paradigm was that every woman was the sort of possession in some way of a man. She was under the kind of responsibility of a man. And women sexually were supposed to be chaste, they were supposed to be demure. There was There still is a double standard regarding sexuality between men and women, but it was particularly strong in those days. And if women did not live up to their expectations of how they should behave, then they would run the risk of being labelled crazy, insane. So it was a kind of dangerous world for a woman in that sense. It could happen that you would be carried off and locked up and told that you were crazy. So there she is. And as we saw, it was Mr. Lloyd who diagnosed her and looked after her. But it could have been different. And all it would have taken, as I said, was the signature of two doctors. They would simply have to say between them that they agreed that she was mad, and that would be it. She'd be taken away and she'd be locked up. Okay, and of course the doctors were all men, and when women behaved in a hysterical way, they were likely to consider them to be insane. So in that sense, Jane had a lucky escape. All right, things could have been different for her. And suppose, things had been different. Suppose she had been taken away and locked up. We need to notice that the book has two women who get locked up in it. There's Jane and there's Bertha. We met Bertha last week, the supposedly wild, untamable Creole woman. Jane would have been locked up in November 1818 when she was a little girl, and Bertha would have been declared insane as an adult a couple of years later, so roughly in the same time frame. Jane Eyre is one of those novels where, because the author gives a few hints about dates, it's possible to create a very accurate timeline of when each event happened. And so suppose she had been, suppose Jane's fate had been similar to Bertha's fate. What sort of treatment could a woman expect if she was considered mentally ill around the early part of the 19th century? Here you can see some examples. They would be locked up in something like that, forced so their body couldn't move. Again, physically kind of coerced into immobility. Chains were routinely used on crazy people. I should say mentally ill people. Straitjackets. More chains. And a bed where you can't, you're just completely, you can't move when you're lying there. I mean, if Jane felt like that when she was locked up in the Red Room, how would she have felt if they put those sorts of things on her? If she wasn't crazy beforehand, she would have been crazy afterwards, wouldn't she? So physical restraint was standard treatment at that time. There were physicians who disagreed, early psychiatrists, Edward Charlesworth, Robert Gardner Hill, John Connolly. These people pioneered a change in approach. So by about the middle of the 19th century, all of this was starting to change. But that's what a person who was diagnosed as mad could expect at the time that Jane Eyre was written. Male or female, they would have been treated in that kind of way. They would basically be kept physically restrained for quite long periods of time. So, as I say, it raises the question of, surely these methods are going to make people crazy, if they're not crazy already. So looking at Bertha, she's also lucky in a sense because she's not subjected to those kinds of chains or restraints. She's not locked up in that kind of way. She's locked up in a room, all right? But beyond that, she's not restrained. So in a sense, she is also lucky, although I don't think anybody could really think of Bertha as being a lucky person. She's locked up in her husband's house with a servant who looks after her. And she even manages to escape several times, at least 3 times in the story. And in the final time she escapes, 3 times in the story, maybe 4. She sets fire to the house and kills herself during one period of escaping from her attic room. But we have to ask ourselves, if we think about how Jane was affected just by being locked up in the Red Room just for a few hours, would we have to say that Bertha is locked up in the attic because she's mad? Or would we say that she's mad because she's been locked up in the attic? I mean, wouldn't being locked up in a place like that turn somebody mad, if they weren't mad already? Well, Bronte is looking at it and she wants her readers to think that Bertha really is mad. And that's pretty clear from the way she presents Bertha. It's not because she's locked up that she's become mad. She's mad because it's inside her basic nature to be mad. And she makes that point fairly strongly by saying that her mother and her grandmother both also went mad. So that's the way she wants her readers to see it, in that kind of way. And, when we looked at it from the point of view of gender and empire and kind of colonialism and racial issues, we were saying that it seems like Rochester is having to pay for what the author sees as his mistake in marrying a Creole woman. But if we look at it, I mean, and I do think that's probably what Bronte is trying to express, right? She's quite narrow-minded as an author. Her attitudes, as we saw last week, towards people who were unlucky enough not to be English, her attitudes were quite negative, weren't they? So we saw that last week, but maybe that's the message she's trying to express. But for a lot of modern readers, that's not the way that people are seeing it. It's not the mistake of marrying a foreigner, it's the mistake of failing to understand a woman's mind, trying to bring her passionate nature under his control, which is what the Victorian age was all about, bringing women under men's control. So looking at it from that point of view, there's quite a lot of sympathy for Bertha. It's not Jane that's striking a blow for women's rights here, it's Bertha. She's taking revenge in the only way she can. She's fighting back. She's giving her life to fight back against male hegemony. There she is, as we saw her last week, burning down the house of the man who oppresses her. And in a sense, she's taking the only revenge that's available to her against her oppressor. So, in a sense, she's the one who's striking a blow for women's rights. All right? You can't do this to me. At least if you can, I'll fight back in any way possible. Just in the same way as Jane fights back against her cousin, desperately. But in this case, it's a more serious scenario, and she dies. So that's another way of looking at the story. I don't think it's what Bronte intended, but it is certainly a way that people are looking at the story these days. And so we see gender, empire, and madness, all of those discourses combining in that image of Bertha burning the house down. She's a victim in 3 ways. She's a victim because she's, from the colonies. She's a victim because she's traumatized. She's mentally, If you think about it, I mean, she's been brought from a warm, colourful country to dark England, and with a serious English gentleman who probably has no idea about how to do things like, I don't know, have real fun in the Caribbean sense. I mean, Caribbean culture, think about the music, think about the way people... Imagine being brought from that kind of society into Victorian England. It must have been a terrible culture shock. Okay? She's traumatized and she's female. So on 3 levels, she is a victim. So I'd like to turn now to Jane and insane Jane. Look at Jane's insanity. It seems like it's a very short-lived thing in the Red Room, but it leaves a scar on her, it affects her. But there's something else. She does grow up learning how to keep her passion under control, keep her feelings in check, through mostly her experiences at school. Helen Burns, who is a very good little girl, and tells Jane that she should learn to, be a kind of good Christian, really, and accept her suffering and accept her situation in life. And her teacher, Miss Temple, whom she likes and admires very, very much. And so she learns how to control her feelings. But it's at that moment when she learns that the man she's going to marry is already married. He's got a wife. And that wife is this mad woman locked up in the attic. Well, again, you can imagine that would be a pretty stressful situation for anybody, wouldn't it? You're just about to marry somebody and it turns out he's already got a wife and she's crazy and she's locked up in the attic. She's only 19 years old at the time. Rochester is much older than her. So she's a young, impressionable, sensitive person, and she's in a state of shock. She decides very quickly that she's not going to do what Rochester wants her to do. She's not going to stay with Rochester as his mistress. He can't marry her legally, so he says, well, you can be my wife in all but name. We'll live together. She says, no way, I'm not going to do that. I know what will happen. You'll lose respect for me if I do that, and I'll end up in a bad situation. Okay, so she decides she's going to leave, and even though she loves him, she's going to leave him. And the words she uses are, I will keep the law given by God, sanctioned by man. In other words, the Christian message, you can only have one woman, one man, you can't have, man can't have 2 women or something like that. And sanctioned by man, I mean, that's in the law. It's not just the Christian law, it's the law of the country. I will hold to the principles received by me when I was sane. When I wasn't mad, I would have accepted those ideas. And now that I am mad, crazy with passion, crazy with confusion, crazy because of this situation, I'm going to follow those rules, that Joshiki. That's all I've got. So laws and principles are not for the times when there's no temptation. We don't need laws when everybody's behaving themselves, do we? It's only when something goes wrong that we need those laws. Those laws are for moments like this, moments of crisis. They have a worth, so have I always believed. And if I cannot believe it now, it is because, again, she says, I am insane, quite insane, with my veins running fire and my heart beating faster than I can count its throbs. And so in this moment of uncontrollable feeling, because of the shock of learning the truth about the man she was going to marry and the whole situation, she woke up that morning thinking she was going to get married, and then a couple of hours later, her whole world has been turned upside down. She is insane with it. All right? And so preconceived opinions, foregone determinations are all I have at this hour to stand by. I can't go by what I feel at this moment. I have to go by the joshiki, the rules of society that I learned when I wasn't feeling like this. And I know that if I wasn't feeling like this, I would stick to the rule. And I'm going to stick to the rule now. So in a sense, she doesn't give way to her madness. She holds on to the rules of her religion and the rules of society, and they keep her on the sort of straight path. So she's not stable enough herself to trust her own judgment, so she's going to make the decision based on the laws and rules of correct behaviour. That's what she figures is the right thing to do. Although actually what she does, we might consider it pretty uncontrolled in a sense, because she just then rushes out of the house and leaves him with making very little preparation. So in that sense, she's putting her trust in God. She's saying, look, I'm doing the right thing here. I'm not staying with this man as his mistress, so I'm just putting my trust to fate, to God. And from a common sense point of view, what she does is kind of in itself a bit pretty crazy, because she sets off on her own. She's got no money. She ends up in a place where she doesn't know anybody. I mean, that's not sensible in a normal, rational way. But in this situation, that's all she seems able to do. And she gets rewarded for it. She's not... Remember we said last week that these Victorian novels, mostly they have some kind of moral message. Jane is rewarded for her strange behaviour. All right, she's not punished for it. It's not like, see, that's what happens when young women go running off in a wild way into the night and off without any money and without knowing. No, she actually gets rewarded for that behaviour, because it's the reasoning behind it is that she's putting her trust in God. The reasoning behind it is that she's following the rules that she understands to be the right way of behaving for her society, and also from a religious point of view. There she goes. Strange house. She doesn't know these people. So she knocks in despair on a stranger's door. And here comes her male cousin, St. John, and his two sisters are inside the house, and he takes her in. He takes her into the house. Now, when I say that Jane is rewarded, she's rewarded in the sense that of all the houses in the whole of England, she's knocked on the one door of people who are actually her family. She doesn't know that she has any family. She thinks she's alone in the world, except for, her John Reed. Well, John Reed has committed suicide. His two sisters are completely different from Jane. Mrs. Reed has died. Suddenly, she's got family. And from that family, it takes time. It doesn't happen immediately. But over the next few months, she learns that she's inherited a fortune. She's got a family. She's got money. In other words, basically, she's being rewarded for going out into the rain and knocking on the door of some strangers. All right? That rain seems to be getting heavier and heavier, doesn't it? Let's move on. Let's get out of that. Her behaviour seems irrational, but she's actually rewarded for it in the pattern of how the novel develops. And I think that's, the reason that Bronte shows it like that is because she's denied her passion. By denying her passion, she's kind of done what society would think is the right thing. And she's put her trust in God. And I noticed that the word wild is one of her favourite words, one of Bronte's favourite words, but it crops up particularly often in this part of the story. Before Jane leaves him, Rochester calls her a resolute, wild, free thing. And when she leaves his house, she says, "I was weeping wildly as I walked along my solitary way. Fast, fast I went, like one delirious, like a crazy person." And all the time, she believes that God must have led me on. All right, she still has this feeling that she must be being guided by God through the wilderness until on a wild night, I think it's about 2 or 3 days after she's left Rochester's house, worn out and in the last degree, ghastly, wild and weather-beaten. All right, look how many times we've got wilderness, wild, wild night, wild and weather-beaten. She comes to the door of her cousin's house, as we just saw. So one of the qualities of that description of that time is wild, wild, wild. All right? So looking at the way she uses that word, which she uses some 80 times in Jane Eyre, it gets applied to the landscape. Rochester himself is described as wild. Sometimes he's got a certain wildness to him. But Jane and Bertha are particularly described as wild at different stages. But Jane is wild and free, and Bertha is wild and chained. She's a wild animal. She's a wild beast. She's wild, but she's lost her human qualities. She's not wild in a way that is admirable or that anybody else would want to be. She's wild and chained like an animal. Jane manages to keep her humanity. And this is what once people were considered insane, they were considered to have lost their basic humanity. So she keeps her conscience, she keeps her self-respect. Bertha loses all her human qualities and she becomes an animal or a goblin in her madness. So there's the basic contrast, wild and free or wild and chained. And from a feminist point of view, obviously, the woman wants to be wild and free. So that's the challenge for Jane, to be wild and free, not wild and chained. But paradoxically, the only freedom she can get is by accepting the rules of society. She can get her freedom, she can be free by accepting rules. But rules, of course, make us less free. How can she be wild and free? And it's a paradoxical thing, isn't it? She's gone off in the rain like that, doing something totally irrational, and yet she's ended up rewarded by having new family and an inheritance, and in the end, she gets Rochester because Bertha dies, and she can marry him in the end. So she gets everything. She gets everything, really, in the end. And sorry? Is there? Oh, okay. Sorry, there should be another print then. Yeah, I'm sorry. I've forgotten that there was a second print. But where is it? Hold on. I think you're going to have to do without it. I think we're nearly. I don't know. I think we're nearly finished the presentation. I think there isn't another print. Maybe I forgot to put this little bit on the print, but basically we're very close to the end of the presentation now, where Rochester. This is at the moment where he's proposing to her, and he says, "Be still, don't struggle so like a wild, frantic bird that is rending its own plumage in desperation." She says, very famously, "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will." This assertion of herself, this is the sort of, this is where Jane Eyre is regarded as a feminist novel, where she makes this kind of statement. That's the kind of person I am. That's what a woman is meant to be. All right? Not under the control of a man who thinks she's a bird and that he can cage her. Okay? So, yeah, basically that's the message here. Just finally then, here's a picture of freeing the insane, where late 19th, 1870s, late 19th century French painting again, taking the chains off the mad people. And as you can see, most of them are, or the ones that are prominent are women, okay, and they're being unchained. And that's the sort of the unchaining of the crazy people as they were seen, the unchaining of the lunatics is also, it's a feminist issue, because there were twice as many women who were locked up and considered insane in that way as there were men. All right, so insanity is very much a feminist issue for the 19th century.